Hello everybody and welcome to the first in Innecto's summer webinar series. I'm here on a very sunny day at Lord's and we're going to talk about a very hot topic on gender pay. Now that year one is done and dusted and the media coverage has died down, our focus as an HR community is turning to what can we learn from year one and how we're going to improve the gap over the next few years. I'm delighted to welcome John Garside, who's the European Director of HR at Equifax, and Rosie and Ranganathan, who's the People Director at ECB. And we're going to talk about what they've been finding out about their about their gender pay agenda and think through how that might work. So welcome along to both of you. Thank you for inviting us here to Lord's, Rosie.
Pleasure.
And let's kick off really. I'm just going to go through a bit of information about how webinars work. So if you're new to webinars as a participant, we're asking you all to mute during the discussion. So please could you mute if you haven't already done so. And on the screen you'll see there's a Q&A box. And the idea of that is that you can type in questions that you may have for John and Rosie for our discussion. We have got time at the end and we're going to go through and answer those questions. If you should encounter any technical issues during the webinar, then you can let us know through that function as well and we'll try and help you resolve it. But we are recording this webinar, so you will be able to come back and listen to the recording afterwards. So the plan is that we're going to discuss gender pay for about half an hour. ECB and Equifax are two very different businesses, and John and Rosie obviously have different experiences of running the reporting processes and what challenges and surprises they face along the way. We'll just finish by discussing what the future holds in both businesses and the steps that companies need to take now to see a reduction or a closure in the pay gap. So, it's showtime. Let's get on with the show. We're going to come to you, Rosie, first. So what did you discover during your analysis of the gender pay gap here at ECB?
So we always knew that this would be challenging for us because we are a male-dominated organisation to start with, so 72% male and 28% female. So we always knew that we were starting from a disadvantage. But I think what was interesting was breaking it down into the pay quartiles, but it's really exacerbated by a high ratio of men to women at all levels, but that senior management level, where we've got 12% female and 88% male, and also the breakdown of the quartiles across the organisation. I think for us, we're similar to, I guess, a lot of other businesses where you've got premium talent that you need to pay for, and you're specialists, and in our case, that's ex-professional athletes. Mm-hmm. We've also got centrally contracted players, both male and female, on our payroll. And again, tradition unfortunately dictates at the moment that male athletes are paid more than female athletes. And the history of the sport, 25 male umpires on our payroll. So we always knew we would be starting from a very heavily skewed male perspective. I think what it has done is helped us open up some of the conversations around those issues within the organisation.
Yeah, that's great. What about you, John? What did you discover during your analysis at Equifax?
I think the first thing we decided quite early on was we weren't going to go it alone, so we actually engaged Innecto at a very early stage, I think, given it was the first year. And we wanted that external expertise and insight, so it wasn't just us thinking about what does it mean, some external insight and view, and well, this is what we're hearing and seeing from other organisations. So that was important for us. The other thing I quickly discovered, actually, because we have two operating businesses, and I initially didn't realise, actually, well, we're going to have two separate reports. Mm-hmm. So that got me thinking about, okay, so if there's going to be some differences, which there were, how are we going to brief that in, and getting us to think about that. Similar to Rosie, I think there was no major surprise in some of the results, particularly thinking about the pay quartiles. That for me was the most interesting area, because that was where the story of why some of the gender pay gaps exist. Again, similar to a lot of organisations, when you get to the middle and top quartile, you can see the skew towards men being predominant in those types of roles, which usually pay more, particularly on base and bonus, and therefore that drives a lot of gender pay gap. In one of our organisations, we had a high proportion of females in the lower pay quartile, which again drove a bigger pay gap in that organisation.
Okay, so what would you say, beyond what you've just described, what were the obstacles and the challenges that you faced in actually getting this on the agenda and getting the work done?
So I think one of the early challenges, particularly when we started briefing and thinking about briefing, was making sure we got the message across around what's the difference between gender pay and equal pay.
Yeah.
And trying to get people to think about what is gender pay driving at, and is that the same as equal pay, which it isn't. And it's interesting, when we briefed, there was people sometimes mixing the two together. And there is a linkage in some respect, but they are addressing two different things.
Absolutely.
And there was some surprises around our bonus levels between the two organisations, which were not gender related, but did raise an issue about equity within the two organisations. One of the other things that this is a nuance about who was in which groups, which did make a difference to the interpretation of why the results came out in the way they did. So understanding some of the detail around that, so you could answer questions, particularly when we did manager briefings. They were wanted to get down to quickly quite a bit more detail than I was expecting, to be quite honest. We're quite an analytical, data-driven organisation. So when we were briefing, there were some people who were saying, well, what if we strip this data out? What would it tell us? And my message was, well, we're not going to mess around with the stats to give us a different picture. It is what it is. But people were very inquisitive about the data and what it meant, and also what we were going to do about it. We got quickly onto, so what does that mean? And in terms of our senior management team, I mean, for me, it was a great lever to start the discussions around not just about women in leadership, but diversity generally in our organisation, how we attract a greater pool of talent into our organisation.
Brilliant. Okay, that's really interesting. Rosie, what about you? What were the sorts of things that you found?
I think for us it was about establishing the principles about who to be included, and we had a lot of discussion around the different categories of workers that we have. So we have a lot of casuals, contractors, as I say, the players, who should be included in terms of the reporting figures. I think it also highlighted some gaps in our processes as well. So things like about how we contract with people, consultants aren't technically, ours weren't paid by an hourly rate, so actually what does that look like, and how we, even down to the wording of our contracts, there's some quite minutiae for us to think about, which we perhaps hadn't anticipated. The systems that we use, so we suddenly discovered that our payroll system and our HR system perhaps weren't talking to each other in the right way to pick up the data that we needed, so we had to do a lot of manual reconciliation. So the amount of preparation needed was quite significant. And we've got a lot of seasonal work as well, so just understanding how that impacts on our figures given the time at which we have to report.
Yes.
So again, we could look very different at different points in the year, depending on when you ask us to run those figures for that seasonal adjustment. I think what it will do is help us tighten up some of our processes as well around payroll, contracting, and how we engage people, so that we're better prepared and we kind of help ourselves and make the figures easier to run in future years. But I think the biggest obstacle was kicking off those guiding principles about who are we reporting on and how do we get that data when you're running multiple payrolls from different parts of the business.
So it sounds like things should be easier this year. And having gone through that experience, what would you say you're most proud of in terms of the ECB's work on gender pay?
I think we were quite early in terms of knowing this was on the horizon, and putting the resource behind it. So working with the Innecto team, but also getting in some specialist resource to actually focus on this, because it's very hard when you do this, and dare I mention GDPR at the moment is an issue, but it's on top of somebody's day job as well. And when you've got a busy team, actually you really need to give this the importance. So putting resource behind it that's able to think strategically about the numbers, but also delve into the detail. So we were very lucky to get that, and also help us set the framework for future years as well, so that we're ready. I think we also worked with our comms team very early on in the process as well. So got them involved in terms of the reporting and the narrative that we wanted to tell, given that we weren't sure whether this would be a story, but what do we want people to say about the ECB in relation to the gender pay figures. We also worked with the other national non-governing bodies just to support one another, really.
Yeah.
And I found that really helpful. You know, HR can be a lonely place, so it's good to have people just to bounce off in terms of what other organisations are doing, when they might publish, what some of the challenges might be. So it was great to have that support as well.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. What about you? Because I guess you're not quite in the same community environment as ECB. What were you proud of in Equifax's work?
Well, we published a deadline, so I was quite pleased on that front. So I mean, I'd say we're in the financial services sector, and that has a particular, some initiatives going to try and drive greater diversity within that sector. We were generally quite favourable, I would say, in that sector. Now, that's not to say, we should rest on our laurels, but that was encouraging from my perspective as an organisation. I think the other thing I was proud of is that we, the exec team, when we briefed, they were very actively engaged and interested in, okay, so what we're doing, what are our actions, and very supportive. And interestingly, when we briefed line managers, so we did briefings across all the line managers, so they understood the detail and some of the rationale and some of the story. So that if and when people asked them questions, they were armed with information, and they were very actively engaged. We got a very high number of volunteers post publishing our results, and about 20 people who said, I want to be involved in some of the initiatives and activities you've highlighted that we're going to take as an organisation. So that was a good indicator from me, so I was really pleased with that.
Yeah.
And I thought we were very open and transparent about our information. We weren't going to try and hide anything. We published the results internally to everybody across the organisation before we went live. We did the manager briefings. And we've got an active group now. We've got a diversity forum that's been set up. I've with one of my team running it with one of the business leaders. So we've got some impetus, I think, just as a starting point for us to address some of the issues we need to address to reduce our gender pay gap.
Okay. And were there any surprises?
In respect to the report, the one I think I alluded earlier. The one surprise was there were some differences between the two operating companies, and that was sometimes hard to explain. So when we briefed one operating company, we actually showed both results.
Yes.
And there was a bit of surprise in the room. We looked up and say, okay, so does that mean we're not as well paid as our colleagues in the other part of the business? And we tried to integrate. That wasn't gender related. It was more around the legacy of how the organisations have worked together. So
you had additional complexity.
Yeah, we did. Yeah,
two lots of numbers and different.
Yeah, and different businesses, and they work much more closely together now than they have done. But it did highlight that to us, so we've got some more work to do there. So that was a bit of an added complexity and surprise for us.
Okay. What about you, Rosie? What were your surprises along the way?
I think if I go back to the pay quartiles and looking at those, so we always knew that the upper and upper middle were going to be high. We had lower middle was great. It went to kind of 50-50, but back down at the lower end of the scale, it was skewed again towards men. So in terms of the talent pipeline coming into the ECB, there's still a lot of men coming in.
Yeah. So perhaps an over-representation of men at the lower end coming in as well.
Yes. And so I think that surprised us because we've been really conscious to widen our recruitment networks and perhaps work with different partners. So we're still not getting the right cut through at those entry level roles. So that's something that we need to think about.
And that leads nicely into talking about what are the steps that you're taking for the future.
So in terms of addressing this, I don't think there's one single thing that will solve it, and I think it's a long-term strategy. In terms of will we see much difference in any of our numbers this time next year? But we've laid out a 2-year diversity action plan, which is our commitment to diversity across all levels, so that's right from board throughout the organisation. Last year we had a project group that specifically looked at the role of women in cricket, and that was both from a play perspective, but also from working in cricket and working at the ECB. And that's been really positive in terms of, again, moving those conversations upwards in terms of importance on the agenda. We've looked at a number of things, such as our maternity policy, flexible working, how we form project groups and how we spotlight our talent within the business. And we've also run a women's development programme as well, and that's been phenomenally successful at helping women find their voice and find their confidence. And as a result of that, we've already seen some of our female talent be promoted.
That's fantastic. So there's some really far-reaching sort of in-depth changes. So it's not really about pay, it's much more about participation and making sure women feel that they're part of the organisation. Turning to you, John, what are your plans for the future at Equifax?
Some similar things to what Rosie talked about and your point around participation. I think for me the key driver is how do you get representation of women in more senior leadership roles. So we've got diversity forum I talked about earlier, and that's about people within the organisation. So this is not about HR or senior management team sitting on a committee. This is about people in the business who are passionate about this, can help us drive this, a change from within the organisation. For me, it's about setting some realistic and practical goals, and also setting expectations about the change that will happen is not a light switch. So, Rosie talked about, once you put the results, will there be a major difference? I suspect a lot of organisations might see some changes, adverse or otherwise. Would that be linked to their action plan? I'd be surprised personally. I wouldn't think some of our actions would have a dramatic impact on our results initially. I think some of these things are a bit of a long burn before you start seeing some real impact.
And I think both of you are organisations who started thinking about this quite early on. There's loads of organisations that literally started thinking about it in February. So clearly they're not going to have any changes in place.
Well, that was one thing I was very surprised at. So when I was working with you guys, and I was, again, quite reassured in some respects that, you guys were still getting requests for help in like January, February. I was thinking, okay, I'm feeling quite all right now, because I was really surprised people were that late, again, given the lead time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, we've had quite a bit of time to think through what we might do. We've been clear on some of our strategies about dealing with this. A lot of it around how do you attract a wider and diverse group of people to the organisation. And it has helped with the discussions around the diversity agenda, not just women in leadership, but diversity generally. It's got us thinking about some of our processes in terms of pay decisions, how we attract, maybe some of the language, tone, and even some of the images we use when we advertise for roles. What does it say about us as an organisation? How can we be more attractive to a wider range of group of people as possible?
Yeah, and I think it's also pushing recruitment companies to look beyond the obvious candidates, to sort of push a bit harder and say, no, there are people out there, let's look a bit further and a bit harder, and I think that can only be a good thing. What do you think the future holds for gender pay generally in terms of reporting and how it's going to roll out?
I think I definitely agree with John. I don't think there'll be a significant difference in terms of maybe year 1, 2, even year 3 figures. I think the reporting remains to be seen from the press, what stance they take, because obviously there's a lot of confusion around it this year, which I don't think helped any of us. And I think, there's certainly more and more, I use the word pressure, which sounds quite negative. I think it's a really positive to embrace the diversity agenda and to turn the dial on this. And that starts from the top. So, for us, we announced this week that we've achieved that just over, I think it's 33% target on our board, which is brilliant, and that gives us a great platform now to really talk with, I guess, more authority and gravitas about making a difference in this area. So I think it'd be really interesting in terms of those companies who've gone late, what happens to them, and watch this space.
Yeah, and are there any teeth really on it? What about you, John? What do you think in terms?
Yeah, just taking the point on the latecomers, so the party. I mean, I was personally a bit surprised that there wasn't more publicity around that. And reputationally, I mean, again, thinking about we were never going to be in a position to publish late because I think reputationally, internally, it's very damaging. Externally, because it must ask the question. So I was a bit surprised that there wasn't a bit more publicity, especially given the publicity the BBC got around some of their issues, which, taking Rosie's point around, the coverage, that was for me a great example of where gender pay and equal pay were mixed together.
Yeah, totally.
Because the BBC's gender pay gap was not significantly worse than a lot of organisations, but I think because of the profile of the organisation and some of the press they got for some of the some things that happen in an organisation, they got some quite adverse press. Yeah. And I'm sure there are lots of organisations who were probably in a similar position to BBC but haven't got the same public profile.
Yeah, I think that whole thing with the BBC where they had to publish the salaries, it scared everybody because obviously no one else had to publish the salaries over a certain amount, but it really stopped where people were thinking of publishing. I think it put things on hold for 3 months because everyone didn't want to have the same exposure. We've got a few questions from the people listening in, so maybe we can go to some of those now. So I'm going to talk slowly to give you a bit of a chance to talk about this. And one of the first questions really touches on that. So we've got a question. Do you think the extensive media coverage of GPG reporting helped or hindered the process? Go on, John, you go first.
I didn't think that. I thought the publicity died down quite quick. I was expecting more publicity. What I did read and see was more around mixing the two together, and which was disappointing. Because I think they are. I think they conflated the two issues.
Yeah.
Maybe a bit more around what gender pay is really about and what other things we need to do. I think not just organisations, but maybe government has to do in terms of encouraging women, particularly in some sectors where they're highly underrepresented or not encouraged. So technology for my organisation is key because we have a high proportion of people in technology space. It's traditionally been a very male-dominated sector. So how do we encourage women at a very early age to feel like that's a career that they could aspire
to? At school, really.
Quite early on, and that's not
early,
and that's not something Equifax alone can do. Lots of organisations, but we have, as part of that, we're thinking about graduate programmes. What type of people we can appeal to, and which universities and institutions we can work with to try and diversify the applicants we have.
And that sort of leads us into a wider question I'm going to put to you, Rosie. So what impact do you think that gender pay reporting has had on the wider community? Is it still an HR issue?
I don't think it's just an HR issue. I think it's broader than that. We're probably the custodians of preparing the data and the narrative behind it, but it's not solely our issue to solve. I think it's people thinking differently about where they recruit, how they recruit, the talent pools that they go to, and just being prepared to keep taking, to think differently about who they might bring into their organisation.
And just going on to that, in terms of the general direction of travel, we seem to be seeing more about the CEO worker pay ratio that people will have to start publishing for next year, and we're hearing that there's also going to be ethnic minority publishing, so comparing the salary around your ethnic representation in the workforce against white. How do you feel generally about increasing pay transparency that's being enforced really from government?
Well,
you go first, John. I'll come back to you.
So again, one of our action plans is around developing some metrics. We haven't cracked that one, by the way, yet. What metrics can we put in place that give us an indicator? Are we heading in the right direction? And that would be around progression of women in the organisation, when we make pay decisions, making sure that we're not doing something unconsciously in terms of decision making. If the gender pay is an example of where you can raise an issue and address it, then you would argue that actually forcing organisations to maybe publish does help raise that up the agenda. My only issue is the gender pay reports are, I've got sometimes quite a blunt instrument. There's quite a lot of nuance behind it, and you can make some interpretations like any statistics that aren't quite right. So, you know, if we are going to be having to report more on, I'd like certainly government to think about, well, what is meaningful information and what is actionable and what is within control of organisations. Otherwise, people can jump to wrong conclusions, I think, sometimes about organisations.
Yeah,
what do you think, Rosie, about this, you know, perhaps increasing pay transparency that's legislated for?
I mean, I would agree with that, with what John said. I think, as well, if I think about the individual, you know, sometimes these are small groups of people, sadly, and I guess protecting them around the data.
So this is particularly perhaps thinking about ethnic reporting.
Yeah,
you can have very small groups who perhaps feel compromised.
Which I know is part of the point, to address the fact that they don't remain small groups.
Yeah.
But thinking back to the BBC and when they started to publish salaries and name people, you know, that was quite uncomfortable because, you know, some of your pay is public.
Yeah.
And so I just worry about kind of protecting those individuals, but also as well, you know, I agree with John's points that he made. You know, it's important that we are fair and transparent, irrespective of gender, diversity, ethnicity, and that it's fair and equitable. And quite how you report on that and evidence that, I guess, is probably a longer discussion.
I think it is, and I also think that from our experience of working with the gender pay regulations themselves, before we came on air, we talked about the fact that some of the way the legislation and certainly the calculations were worked out was quite tricky. So we'd hope that if we are going to go into BAME reporting, so ethnic reporting against the salaries of white employees, that there's more thought, as you said, to reduce perhaps exposure or information about people which may make them feel uncomfortable, then it's going to be even more crucial in that circumstance. Okay, that's been really interesting. Thank you both for being so honest about how challenging it's been. I'm sure lots of people in the audience will be thinking the same thing. There were some real challenges, but also having gone through it once, at least we know what to expect, and systems and information have started to talk to each other, perhaps in a way that it wasn't before this was brought in. So thank you very much, both of you, John and Rosie, for sharing your experiences and your plans for the future. And thank you to people that have joined us for the event. This is the first of our summer season of webinars, so do look out for more which might interest you. And the next one coming up is about how to build a case for HR Tech, which is with the HR Director of Charles Truett, and we're running that next week. So we're going to sign off now, and I think it's time for lunch.